sharing it. Am I sharing your screen?
Okay, guys, we're starting. Please show the video now.
Sound, please.
Well, hi everyone. We're just showing you a video about your access, but we seem to be having a few problems with the sound. So just bear with us for a few minutes or seconds. Hopefully we can fix it. But I don't think we can, so no worries. Let me just welcome all of you to this session today. Maybe the tech support, if we can just stop the video if the sound is not working. This is no problem. Okay, thank you. This is IT. Welcome to 2021. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this second session in the Euraccess Career Development Series. Some of you joined us last time. We had a wonderful session on how to write a PhD proposal, and today we are looking at another fabulous and very important issue, and this is all about science communication, meaning the ability to communicate your fabulous scientific ideas to different audiences, to funders, to colleagues, to maybe the media, and also being able to speak in different formats about your scientific ideas. Now we can, I'm sure, all learn more about this. You know, this is something where you're never good enough, I believe. So we have invited a fabulous speaker for you who will share his wonderful expertise with us to make us all better science communicators. And we're joined today from Edinburgh by Dr. Sam Illingworth. Hi, Sam, how are you?
Hi, Jenny. Very well. Thank you very much. So, Suzanne, doing very well. Thank you.
Perfect. And before I hand over to Sam, I want to say a few words about him so that you know who our trainer is today. So Sam Illingworth is Associate Professor in academic practice at the Edinburgh Napier University in beautiful Scotland. So I hope you have a nice spring out there right now. His research is concerned with trying to engage and empower people with science, especially those without a voice. And he does something fabulous. He writes science poems to try and communicate some of the beautiful and important scientific research that is being done on a daily basis all across the world. Sam has internationally recognized expertise in interdisciplinary studies. He has a background in environmental science. He is also a senior fellow of the UK's Higher Education Academy with 60 publications under his belt and an age index of 15. So he obviously is very good at communicating his ideas. He's also the chief executive editor of Geoscience Communication. He's co-director of the Manchester Game Studies Network, and he is founder of the poetry journal Consilience. He is the author of a number of publications, including A Sonnet to Science, Effective Science Communication, and The Poetry of Science. And I have to say, Sam, I find this absolutely fascinating. I hope that you will share one of your poems with us today throughout the presentation. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed. Now, before I hand over to Sam, this session today, first of all, is being recorded. And Sam has already agreed he will share his presentation slides with us later on. And we will, of course, make sure that you have access to this material. This is meant to be an interactive session as much as possible. So we invite you to use the question function here in the GoToWebinar portal. So whenever you have a question for Sam, please type it And we will make sure in the Q&A session, after Sam has finished his presentation, we will, of course, bombard him with all your questions and he will try and answer them. So Sam, that's it from me. I wish all of us a fabulous session. And now, Sam, the floor is yours.
That's great. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. So very shortly, I should be being made host of this so that I can share my screen with you and share the presentations that I've got with you, which would be great. And until I do that, I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today. So yeah, as the introduction came, my name's Sam Illingworth. I'm Associate Professor in Academic Practice at Edinburgh Napier University. Here are the details for my contact. Please do feel free to get in contact with me via my website or via Twitter at Sam Illingworth at any time. And what we're going to be looking at today really is thinking about how to communicate science effectively. I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes and then there's going to be time for Q&As. Please do feel free to ask any questions that you might have. Really happy to answer any of them. And I don't know if I'll share some of my poetry, but poetry will certainly feature later on. So I just want to get started really by thinking about the two faces of science communication. So many of the people in the audience today will be at various stages of their scientific career. We might have some undergraduates, we might have some postgraduates, we might have some postdoctoral students, some lecturers, some senior lecturers, some professors even. But at every single stage of our scientific journey, there's two different ways in which we communicate science. There's an inward-facing side and there's an outward-facing side. Now, the inward-facing side is communicating to other scientists. So this is a very important part of our role. It's oral presentations at conferences, it's poster presentations, as we see here, it's peer-reviewed publications. So this is how we communicate our research to other experts in the field and to other scientists. Very important part of our job. An equally important part of our job, but something that doesn't always get as much attention or as much training, is outward facing. So outward facing is about communicating our science, communicating our research to a non-scientific audience. So this is communicating to school children, it's communicating to journalists, it's communicating to policymakers, it's communicating to community members, it's communicating to anybody who is impacted by the scientific research that we do, and also science more generally. So we need to think about inward-facing science communication, and we need to think about outward-facing science communication. And in the rest of this short talk, I'm going to be giving some examples about how we can develop skills that are appropriate for both. And I'm also going to give us some specific examples about inward-facing science communication as well. But it's really important to remember that as scientists, we need to think about how we communicate our research to other scientists, but also to non-scientists as well. So I'm going to start off by talking about presenting, and this is general presenting with a slight focus on oral presentations as well, but just generally about presenting. And I want to begin with this image. So this is a image that I've adapted by work from Peck and Dickinson in their 2009 publication. And this is what I call the triangle of effective communication. So in order to communicate effectively, we need to consider three things. We need to think about the narrative. So that's what we're saying. We need to think about the audience. So that's who we're saying it to. And we need to think about the self. So that's how we're saying it. And in order to have truly effective communication, we need to think about these three elements. And if we don't have all three of these elements, we don't have a triangle and we don't have effective communication. So we need to think about what we're saying, who we're saying it to, and how we're saying it. One of the great ways that we can really help to structure our narrative and think about what we're saying, but also think about those other elements as well, is to think about rhetoric. Now, rhetoric sometimes gets a bit of a bad reputation, but rhetoric is basically the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. So what this means is that we're using every single tool that we have so that the audience wants to listen to us, the audience is able to take on board what we're saying, and we're able to develop a dialogue with our audience. Rhetoric has three key components. So we have ethos, we have logos, and we have pathos. So ethos is an appeal to the ethics. Now, this is a means of convincing someone of the credibility of the persuader. So what this is about establishing your credibility as a speaker or as an expert. So an example of this is at the very start of this presentation, I had that wonderful introduction. Thank you so much for that, which hopefully gave you the confidence that I am an expert in science communication and I am worth listening to. If I'd have turned up to this presentation late, bowled in, said, "Hi, my name's Sam, here's some slides, don't really know what I'm talking about," you'd have felt less confident and my credibility as a speaker would not have been established. Now, the great thing is that as scientists, we have that credibility. Members of the public trust scientists, and scientists have, no matter what point in your journey, you have knowledge and expertise and a reputation, which means that people will want to listen to what you have to say. One of the biggest problems with establishing our credibility sometimes is having the confidence that we are worth listening to. So as scientists, we have this credibility as a speaker. You just need to have the confidence that you are worth listening to, because you are. Logos. Logos is an appeal to logic. It's about building a logical argument. Now, as scientists, this is something that we're very familiar with. So think about the scientific process. We have a hypothesis, we test that hypothesis, we revisit that hypothesis. There's a very logical order in the way that we present an argument. So when we're constructing a narrative to communicate to a scientific or a non-scientific audience, the logos is actually quite strong. It's something that we do naturally if we're ethical scientists. Now, oftentimes we might see politicians or unscrupulous journalists sometimes resort to rhetoric without the use of logic. So you can see people making arguments where there isn't a logical underpinning. And part of our job as scientists is actually to call out instances where we see examples of logic not being used, where there's a baseless rhetoric, if you will. And then finally, we have pathos. So pathos is an appeal to the passion, and it's a way of convincing an audience and creating an emotional response. And it's about appealing to the audience's emotions, both positive and negative. So their happiness, their excitement, but also their fear, their anger. And this is something that scientists don't do particularly well. Now, as scientists, we're always taught to present the cold hard facts. And I think that's really quite dangerous. I think when we're doing our scientific research, we need to be very objective. But I think when we're talking about the impact of our scientific research, I think it's important to show passion. Think about if you're a climate change researcher, if you're investigating sea level rise in Bangladesh, that's a very emotive subject. Like, it's very difficult not to get angry or upset or scared about the implications of your research. And
Sam, can you hear me?
And also yourself. Yes, I can hear you.
Sorry, we just lost you, but you're back.
Okay, so think about ethos, which is an appeal to the ethics, the credibility of the speaker. Think about logos, which is an appeal to the logic of your argument. And think about pathos, which is an appeal to the passion. And it's a way of convincing your audience and really demonstrating that you are a member of society as well. So pathos is maybe the thing that we need to work harder at as scientific researchers. So the next thing I'd like to think about is framing. So framing really is how we can present our research in such a way that it is suitable for our audience. So there's a really nice quote here from this paper that says that frames organize central ideas, defining a controversy to resonate with core values and assumptions. Frames pare down complex issues by giving some aspects greater emphasis. They allow citizens to rapidly identify why an issue matters, who might be responsible, and what should be done. What does this mean in practice? Got a really nice, so basically, in essence, framing theory suggests that how something is presented to the audience, the frame, influences how it is processed. So an example here, there's a relatively well-known example of the framing effect, which in 2009, there was a study which basically looked at whether or not people registered early for a particular conference or not. And what they found was that if they said about this conference, if you register early, you will get an early bird discount. So you'll get a little bit of money off the conference fee by registering early. 67% of PhD students decided to register early. However, when instead they framed it as saying, if you don't register early, you'll get a penalty fee for late registration, 93% of PhD students registered early. So it's the same saving, but it's being framed as a penalty fee rather than as an early bird discount. And this really appeals and really thinks about the audience, the way that it's framed, and it puts urgency on the audience to do something about it. So the way that we frame a message really impacts on the way that it is perceived and the way that it is dealt with by our audience. So if we think about topics in science that are not controversial, but that have many different opinions around them, climate change, evolution, vaccinations, to name but three, we need to think very carefully about how we frame the message to the audiences that we're speaking to. And in all instances, we need to do so in a way that is appropriate, that is fair, and that is non-judgmental. For example, if you are presenting research that wants to try to convince people that vaccinations are a good idea, which we know they are, and you're trying to work with a group of people who are categorized as anti-vaxxers, going into that audience and simply telling them you are wrong is not a good way of framing the message. People don't like to be told that they're wrong. Instead, going into that audience, listening to their needs, their experiences, why they have vaccine hesitancy or why they're against vaccines, listening to that and then using that to frame your argument and construct your message is a much more effective way of talking about your work. So we've thought about the narrative, what we're saying. We've thought about the audience, who we're saying it to. But what about the self? Now, part of the biggest issues with communicating and presenting in an oral presentation or a digital presentation like this, or speaking to our supervisor or speaking to a parliamentary select committee is nerves. And I've just put together 3 slides here about dealing with nerves before, during, and after a presentation. So the best piece of advice I can give is to practice. Practice, practice, practice. I tend to practice each presentation, like this one included, about 5 to 10 times. And the reason for that is it means that I don't become nervous because I know what's coming next. I would advise not learning a script, because if you learn a script, it can sound rehearsed. And also, if you forget what you're saying, like momentarily, you can become lost and it can become very panicky. So instead, what I recommend doing is practicing with slides, knowing roughly what you want to say, and then just trying to say those key points every time. I also then practice without slides so that I know what the transitions are going forward. So practice, practice, practice is the best piece of advice for dealing with nerves, because it tends to then remove the element of uncertainty. Drink water. I always have water with me before and after, just because it wets the throat and just helps to prepare yourself, and just relax. So try to put yourself in a state of mind in which you're looking forward to the opportunities to present your work rather than being scared about it. And sometimes it might help to just find 2 or 3 minutes by yourself where you can sit down in relative peace and quiet and just take the time to yourself to mentally prepare. In terms of during the presentation, 3 tips I would advise are to pause. So pausing helps to give emphasis to what you're saying, and it also allows you to collect your thoughts if you've momentarily lost your train of thought. Slow down. There's a temptation to speak as quickly as possible, but actually, when we listen to the best orators, the best speakers, the best presenters, they tend to speak relatively slowly because they know that people want to listen to what they have to say and they're in no rush to get it out. And eye contact. So I recommend trying to make eye contact with people when you're presenting anyway. In a digital arena, I know that's difficult. But another reason is that if you're in a face-to-face environment, giving a presentation to several hundred people, it can be quite nervous. But if you ask a friend or a colleague to sit on the front row and direct the presentation towards them, then you can become less nervous. And then as you feel more confident, you can bring out the presentation to the rest of the room and then bring it back to them if and when you need to. And then finally, afterwards, how do we deal with nerves? Reflect. So think about what went well with the presentation, what didn't go well with the presentation, what will you do differently next time? Treat yourself. Always give yourself a treat. You know, you've just done something great. So like after I do this presentation, I'm going to go treat myself by going for a lovely walk in the beautiful spring sunshine that we have here in the UK at the moment. And just be kind to yourself. Every presentation you do, there'll be mistakes. There'll always be something you can do better, but don't beat yourself up about it. Things happen, mistakes happen. People will forgive you for mistakes. Just be honest, be true to yourself, and be kind. And that's the best advice I can give for how to deal with nerves. So the key messages that I want to communicate here for presenting are: remember the triangle of effective communication. Narrative, what you want to say. Audience, who you're saying it to. And self, how you're saying it. Use rhetoric to construct your narrative. So think about ethos, the credibility of the speaker. Think about logos, the logic of the argument. And think about pathos, an appeal to the emotions. Use framing to consider your audience. How can you think about the needs and experiences of your audience to construct your message in such a way that it will be well received by them? And be kind to yourself. And of all of these, the last is definitely the most important. Presentations can be quite stressful, whether it be a one-on-one talk with your supervisor or a keynote in front of thousands of people. But if you're kind to yourself, if you practice, if you use all of these tips, then you can turn it into a positive experience that you can then reflect upon and help to develop for your learning going forward. So I just want to take one element of the inward-facing aspect of science communication, which is poster design. And I know it might seem at the moment that going to a poster conference is a long way away. Actually, there's many online poster conferences at the moment, and posters will continue to be a very important part of scientific conferences. The reason why posters are important is that basically, if you go to a large scientific conference with thousands of people, not everybody can have an oral presentation. Some people have posters, and posters are great. They're definitely not secondary to oral presentations at all. A typical poster session tends to be a couple of hours, like we can see here, people stood next to the posters and talking about their work and research. And with an oral presentation, you normally get 2, 3, 5 minutes of questions. Whereas with a poster presentation, you can have several hours of talking to people about your research, getting feedback, brainstorming ideas, and finding wonderful ways to collaborate. So I really think that posters are something that are very important for scientific research, a great way of communicating your work and a great way of developing dialogue with different audiences. The best piece of advice I can give, and the first piece of advice, is really about using structure to tell a story. So think again about the cultural environment in which you are. For example, if we're presenting posters in Europe or in America or in the West, we tend to read from left to right and from top to bottom. So having a logical flow to the poster in which we start with the context and the rationale, we move on to methods, results, and analysis, and then we finish with conclusions and future plans, really helps us to tell a story as we're going forward. And remember, with a poster, there'll be times when you're stood next to it, and there'll be times when you're away from it. You want people to be able to read the poster by themselves, but you also want to be able to help people talk through it if they want that advice. Use text sparingly. So you can see here on the right, this is from a paper that I co-authored with my colleague Arianna Soldati, which looks at the ways in which volcanoes have been represented in poetry from the 19th century to the present day. On the right, we have the abstract for this paper, which is a well-written abstract, but it's not particularly appealing to look at. However, on the left, we have another abstract. Arianna drew the picture of a volcano and I wrote a poem. So the abstract is not a god, but unaffected as we swarm like ants across your convex canopy, emerging from our shared landscape to create new identities that stretch beyond the rich and fertile soils that bask beneath your presence. Your destructive nature respected and then considered as we celebrate the otherness of your existence, naive in our assumptions that you would sense our feats beneath the shadow of your magnificence. So I think that and the image is far more appealing and arresting than a block of text. So use text sparingly. I think 200 to 300 words. It doesn't seem much, but really limit the amount of text on your poster because you want people to be able to see it from a distance, to be inspired to go and read it and find out more about your work. Check your spelling and grammar. So when you do have text, make sure there are no typographical errors, as otherwise your poster can look really unprofessional. Sometimes as well, you might be copy and pasting text. So just be really, really careful. If English isn't your first language, or if you're presenting in a language that isn't your first language, get a friend or a colleague who is a native speaker to check it over, as that will really, really help. And it will just help to make your work look more professional. Use a color wheel. So a color wheel, basically, as you can see here, what this shows us is complementary colors. So for example, what we do is you look at a color and then look at the color that's opposite it. And those two colors provide the most contrast. So for example, if we look at yellow, if we have a yellow background, then having purple text, which is opposite yellow on the color wheel, provides the greatest contrast. So if we're using different colors, just think about how we can introduce the greatest contrast to help our readers. I tend to, a lot of the time, just have plain black text on a white background, because that also aids people that might be have color blindness. So it really, really helps with that regard as well. But if you are using different colors, then just think about using a color wheel. And less is more. So this is a really nice development of the McDonald's logo. And you can see, I think the one on the far right is far more interesting than the one on the far left. So don't be busy. Really think about the rationale for every single piece of imagery and text that you have on a poster. Everything should be there for a purpose and should be self-explained. Provide further information. So you can see here, here's a little bit of a kind of a clip that I would have at the top of the poster, and also a QR code. So I think including QR codes on posters is a really good idea, as what it does is it enables people to just scan the poster, find out more information about you. The QR code might take you to your personal website, to your Twitter account, to a paper that you want to advertise, to your university's homepage. And it's a great way of providing extra information. Now, sometimes with a poster, you're going to be stood next to it, presenting it. Other times you'll be away from it. It's really important that people know how they can get in contact with you. So providing further information and including a QR code is a great way to do that. You can generate QR codes for free by literally just Google searching generate QR code free, and it will enable you to do that for a specific website. So thinking about all of those pieces of advice, is this a good poster? So I designed this poster so I could be honest about it. This is a poster that I designed when I was doing my postdoctoral research quite a while ago now at the University of Manchester. And it was about using the instrument on an aircraft to make measurements of ground-based carbon monoxide. And it's an absolute mess. I tried to be really innovative, thinking I won't have any text, I'll just have images linking to each other. I'll use the color scheme of the university, which is purple and gold. And it's just really difficult to read and to follow and to understand. You have to follow arrows around. The text isn't easy to read. There's too much going on. I didn't apply any of the design principles that I've just talked about. What about this? So this is a poster from work when I was at Manchester Metropolitan University looking at a science and art module that I had developed. And there's a relatively large amount of text here, but it's clear. You can easily get my contact information and my co-authors. There's a logical flow to it. There's nice imagery and it's clean. So it's very, very straightforward to read. It's on a crisp background. If I was to be honest, I think I would have removed some of the text. But apart from that, I think this is quite a good poster that adheres to many of the design principles that I've just been talking about. So the key messages for developing a science poster: have a clear narrative. Again, it should be easy for the reader of the poster to be able to follow it through, to read all of the different sections in a logical argument. And similarly, it should be easy for you to help and provide additional context if the reader wants that. Use less text. Aim for 200 to 300 words across the whole of the poster. I know that can be a bit of a challenge, but especially if you're using A1 or A0 size poster, but I think it's a really good thing to aim for. Check the formatting, think about grammar, think about spelling. If you're not a native speaker of the language in which you're presenting, get a native speaker to have a look at it and provide further information. How can people get in contact with you? How can people find out more about your work? How can people find out more about the research that you're talking about? So the last thing I'd like to talk about really today is about presenting digitally. So obviously, because of COVID, we now live and work in an environment where we're expected to present our work digitally to audiences across the world, exactly as I'm doing now. And this has many different benefits. It means that I can talk to people at times that we can make convenient. It means that we have less of a travel issue. But there are also many other things that we need to consider that can be difficult. So I'm just going to present a few ideas that I think are really important for us to think about when we're presenting our work digitally via a presentation, via a team meeting, or via just a one-to-one conversation. So the most important thing is to not forget the analog. So when we're presenting digitally, don't forget all of the key lessons that you should have been learning about presenting your work in a face-to-face environment. So thinking about the narrative, the audience, the self, the use of rhetoric, the use of framing, and these 3 points here as well. There are many publics. So when you're communicating to a non-scientific audience, they don't necessarily identify themselves as a non-scientific audience. They identify themselves according to many different things. They might identify themselves as a football fan, or as a video game fan, or as a parent, or as a carer, or as a member of a religious organization. So people tend not to identify themselves as being a non-scientist. And if you think about your own identity, as well as being a scientist, you have many, many other things as well. So, I'm a scientist, but I'm also a poet, I'm a games designer, I'm a dad, I'm a father, I'm a follower of Leeds United Football Club, and these are all of my different publics to which I belong. So there is no such thing as a general public. There are many different publics, and we need to frame our message according to those audiences. All voices should be heard. So we need to make sure that when we're communicating digitally, that we create an environment and we use a platform in which all members of the public that we're engaged with can potentially become engaged. And that can be really hard, especially when we think about the access to digital provisions that certain audiences may or may not have. And then finally, attendance does not equal engagement. So just because somebody's attending a presentation or a webinar doesn't necessarily mean that they're engaged. So how can we build in ideas of engagement to our digital presentations? So be interactive. Think about using polls, think about having a chat, think about having a Q&A, building activities, introducing an element of creativity, and almost all of the online software that we use enables this. So we could have polls, we can have chats, we can have Q&A. Chats and Q&A are enabled in this particular webinar. So please do drop chats into the questions so we can pick those up as we go along. Please feel free to put things into the chat as well to everybody. And that would be really, really helpful. So we can also, they're building activities and creativity. And I'm just going to give you an interactive example. So we mentioned poetry earlier, and poetry is actually a really, really effective way of getting people to think about engaging on a certain subject. And a very simple poem is a list poem. Now, a list poem is literally where you list down every single thing that you associate with a particular subject. So it might be what's outside your window. It might be what's your favorite things to eat. It might be what are the countries that you visited. But it's also not just actual items, it's ideas, it's feelings, it's emotions, it's concepts. And you list all of these things down, and it's a really, really nice way of getting people to share their feelings. So we're going to do that now. So I'm going to give everyone 1 minute. I'm just going to time yourself. And I want you to write down everything that comes into your mind when you hear the word science. So start writing now. So as you're writing down, I'm just going to continue talking over the top of you, and I'll tell you when the minute's up. But think about all of the things that you associate with the word science. So these can be things in your day-to-day research, they can be things from your past, they can be things in your future. Remember, they're not just necessarily literal things like lab, bench, computer. They're ideas, so happiness, their memories, their feelings, happiness, despair, excitement, nervousness, and list all of these things that you associate with the word science. And as you're writing this down, it can be in any language. It doesn't necessarily have to be in English, but just write down all of the things that you can. You've got 5 seconds left, and then you can stop. And stop now. Okay, so if you'd like to, please do feel free to share that in chat with me. You can share it in the chat with the organisers or the organisers and panel. Feel free to copy and paste that list poem into the chat window. But by having that interactive example, what we've done is we've enabled people to have a voice. We've broken up what is a large time of me speaking at you, and instead we've created an environment in which we can have interactivity and in which we can use creativity as well. So questions, chats, polls are really, really effective way of engaging an audience in a digital environment, but we can also think creatively and try to think of a way to which you can engage the audience in an interactive manner. Remember all audiences. So it's great today we're speaking on GoToWebinar. People have got a relatively fast broadband connection. This is fantastic. But what about when we want to work with those audiences who maybe don't have high-speed internet, or who maybe don't have access to different streaming platforms? So really think about how you can develop a message so that all audiences, or the audiences that you want to work with, it's appropriate to them and it's appropriate to the digital technology that they have available to them. So the key messages for presenting digitally: don't forget your analog training. Pick a platform that works for your audience. Make the session interactive, and create an environment in which all voices can be heard, and be creative. And that's all I wanted to say in terms of developing presentations, thinking about posters, thinking about digital communications. If you want further reading, this is a textbook that I authored with my colleague Grant Allen about effective science communication that contains lots of information about oral presentations, about writing scientific papers, about presenting to non-scientific audiences as well. So I'm going to open for questions in a second, but before I do so, I just wanted to really remind you of the key messages in today's presentation. So if you can remember anything, just bring it back to that triangle of effective communication. So think about the narrative, what you're saying, think about the audience, who you're saying it to, and think about the self, how you're saying it. When you're thinking about the narrative, use rhetoric to develop your ethos, your credibility as speaker, your logos, the logic of the argument, and your pathos, the appeal to the emotions. When you're thinking about the audience, remember to frame your message accordingly. Do this by asking your audience, finding out about their needs and experiences rather than assuming it, and then framing your message accordingly. And when you're thinking about the self, take the time, practice, reflect, but most importantly of all, be kind to yourself. I can't stress that enough. So I'm really happy now to answer as many questions as you might have. But also, please do feel free to follow me on Twitter at Sam Illingworth, or get in contact with me via my website, and I'm happy to answer any questions now or in the future that you may have. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Sam. Now, not only have I thoroughly enjoyed that, but I've got so many positive comments here in our chat box that people really enjoy your presentation. Thank you so much. I think that was excellent. Now we have a few questions to start off with, and I think as we go along, people will kind of join in. We have a question first of all from Ben in the Philippines, who's asking us, how much creativity is too much in science communication, in your opinion? What do you think?
Okay, there's no such thing as too much creativity. I think there's a bit of a misnomer, because I think scientists are incredibly creative people. Like, sometimes people associate creativity with the arts, you know, with writing poetry, with making visual art, with sculpting, with painting, with dancing. But actually, creativity is just about coming up with innovative ways of solving problems and coming up with problems as well. And no one does that better than scientists, really. So I actually think scientists are incredibly creative people, and doing your research is incredibly creative. So there's no such thing as too much creativity. But what I would say is it's really important to think about and understand your audience. Because if you're presenting in an environment where people will not necessarily be appreciative of an overly artistic method of communication, then you should be thinking about other ways in which that work can be presented in that particular format.
Okay, thanks so much, Sam. We have a question from someone in Indonesia who is asking, hello, I'm Agus from Jakarta. Do you agree that the first 15 minutes of a presentation is most critical when trying to present something?
Okay, the first 15 minutes, wow. Well, a lot of the times you might not even get 15 minutes in a presentation. So a lot of the times at scientific conferences, you'd probably have 12 to 15 minutes unless you're giving a keynote. I would say, though, that that initial first couple of minutes is very important for laying down the foundations as your credibility as a speaker. Now, I know that a lot of times when people present, they're taught to give like an overview slide at the beginning saying, I'm going to be talking about this point, then this point, then this point, then this point, then this point. Actually, I think that's quite bad practice, because if you've only got a limited amount of time, that can take up a lot of your presentation. it's much better just to have an opening slide to say, introduce yourself, explain why you are worth listening to in this particular context, and give an overview of what you're going to be speaking about. So, you know, in today's presentation, hi, my name's Sam Illingworth. I'm an associate professor. I'm an expert in science communication. In today's session, we're going to be talking about how you can present digitally, how you can design posters, and how you can really think about communicating your message effectively to different audiences. And then start. We don't need to have an introductory slide where we're spending 3 or 4 minutes talking about what we're going to be talking about. And then also at the end, it's important to recap. I tend to not have too much text on my slides unless they're the final key messages or the final conclusion slide or the key points, so that people can take notes at that point, and that can be quite helpful.
Thank you, Sam. I have a question here from someone based in Vietnam who's wondering about poster presentations. So this person is wondering how to actually get the audience to come and take a look at the poster. Should you just passively stand there, or should you just somehow try and engage with the audience? What is your advice?
That's a really good question, and yeah, thanks for asking that. So it's really hard because you don't want to be overly aggressive. You know, you're not a salesperson telling people to come and speak to you, but you want people to engage with your work. So what I advise is, first of all, make a poster that looks appealing, that people want to come and look at. And then I tend to stand to one side, let people read the poster by themselves, and give them a couple of minutes, and then just say something like, oh, hi, my name's Sam, this is my work. If you've got any questions, I'd be really happy to answer them. Or if you want me to talk you through the poster, let me know. And again, what I'd advise doing is kind of practice a 2 or 3 minute short presentation in which you talk through people through the poster. The poster should be there to be read by itself, but you should be able to provide additional context as well. So yeah, stand next to your poster, stand off to one side, give people time to breathe, give them 2 or 3 minutes just to start ingesting the information. Then just say politely, hi, my name's whatever, I'm in charge of, or I did this research. If you've got any questions, please let me know. Or if you'd like me to talk you through the poster, please let me know. And that's I think the most effective and most polite way of doing that.
Thank you, Sam. I think here is another very important question, and I'd like to know about this as well. This is from To Tan Luan. I think this person is based in Vietnam as well. And they're wondering, dear Sam, can you share your experience on how to manage your time when presenting?
Really good question again. So most important thing is, in advance, find out exactly how much time you've got to do the presentation. Then what I do, if it's a 15-minute presentation, practice so much, because it is really rude to go over your time, I think, because it eats into the other presentation time, it eats into your question time, it just messes everything up. So never go over time. Practice so that you know exactly how long it's going to be. And then what I always do is, normally you'll be in a position where you'll have a little timer in front of you, but ask the chair of your session or the organizer to give you a 5-minute warning if it's appropriate. In a digital space, that's not always possible. You don't want people interrupting you. So I have my clock next to me here. I knew I had 45 minutes to speak, so I did a stopwatch countdown from 45 minutes. And then when I was coming towards the end of it, I knew to wrap up. So I would always ask the person who's organizing it to give you a 2 or 3 minute warning, and just time yourself and practice in advance. And the more that you practice, the more comfortable you will be in being able to deliver that material. Again, rough rule of thumb, aim for 1 slide per minute. That's quite a good rule of thumb for timing as well.
Thank you, Sam. There's another very interesting question, I think. I wonder whether you can explore that as well. It's from Zirapat Bunkrong, probably from Thailand. And this person is wondering what the main difference is between a written piece of communication and an oral or a poster presentation. What are the the main things to look out for?
Well, okay. So I'd say they're really different ways of presenting your work. The great thing about So a written piece of information is very, very passive. Like, people engage with it. You're not there to be able to help people understand it. So what people read needs to be exceptionally well communicated. There needs to be a very logical flow, and it needs to be able to be understood without you being there. In an oral presentation, you can remove a little bit of that because you're there to provide additional context. You might purposefully choose to leave out complex ideas or ideas that can spark conversations because you know they'll come in the question and answers. For me, a genuine example is I purposefully left out in this presentation how to actually present a poster because I knew that question would come up, and it did come up, which was great. With a poster presentation, you can do even more of that because you're going to be stood next to a poster for 2 or 3 hours to be able to provide as much context as you want. So the poster, again, should be read by itself, but you can not leave stuff out, but you can leave a lot of the context out so that you can provide that so that people can come to you to find out more of that information. So I guess think of it as kind of a sliding scale from written publication, oral presentation, poster presentation, in terms of it needs to be explicitly laid out what you're communicating without any interpretation in a writing paper, up to you being able to provide quite a lot of context in a poster.
Thank you, Sam. There's another question which I think is extremely timely. This really relates to how we're all communicating nowadays, which is via a computer. So we don't see our audience. And this is a question from Liz Albert. And Liz is saying whether you have any tips on how to deal with presenting digitally when you don't see the audience reaction to what you're presenting. Do you have any tips on how to deal with this?
It's really hard. It's really hard because, you know, it's when you're presenting, it's really not, you've got visual cues to go off people. In sometimes when you're using Zoom or GoToMeeting or MS Teams, whatever, people will have their webcams on, so you can react to that, which is great. But as I was saying, be interactive. So if you've even try to building exercises that ask people to interact with what you're presenting. Ask people to put things in the chat as you go through. Ask people to respond. Let them know what they're thinking. Add the reactions on, like some platforms have reactions that you can put on. But basically create as many opportunities as you can purposefully for people to engage. And we've got this Q&A session, which is great. It was nice, Suzanne, like summarize that people are enjoying the presentation. You can see things pinging up in the chat as you go along, but purposefully create inflex points that people can input into the presentation, so you know that they're there, you know that they're enjoying it, and if they're not, you're able to adapt to it as you go.
Thank you, Sam. There's another question which is related. I've just recently participated in a conference where the presenters were presenting a digital poster. So it's like a conference, only that you're not actually physically present. This is from Ivan Pham Lee from Vietnam as well. Do you have any suggestions how to navigate this new challenge?
Again, absolutely. So it will depend on the conference. So the most important thing, again, is always find out about what the constraints are for that conference. This is in a face-to-face conference as well, because you might have a physical limiting space for the poster. So I can give you a specific example. So the European Geosciences Union, which runs every April, the virtual EGU 2021 will be April this year. And people will be invited to present their work as a digital poster. So what will happen in this instance is people have to upload their poster by a certain date, maybe let's say 3 weeks before the start of before the session. People will then have 3 weeks to go and look at that poster and comment on it. And then there'll be a 2-hour session in which there'll be an interactive chat where each of the poster authors is afforded 3 or 4 minutes to talk about their work, to answer questions, etc. So actually, again, there's lots of space for interaction, but it's about really understanding the medium, understanding the conference, looking at the opportunities that are afforded to you there and the constraints, and then designing your poster according to those constraints that maximize the opportunity for interactivity.
Thank you, Sam. There's another question from Vietnam. This person is wondering about using color in posters and presentations. There's a specific question: how many colors should one use to make it impressive, but I guess not overly excessively complicated? I know you touched on this in the presentation. Maybe you could share some advice.
Of course. I think it's a matter of preference, but personally, I just like clean white background, clean black text, no background images unless it's a title slide, because it just can become really distracting. So I think the cleaner the image, it looks better from a design point of view. It also means that people where that language isn't their first language can read it more clearly. So I would advise against using lots of different background images. I would advise against using lots of different color. I would try to stick to a clean white background with clean black text. Similarly, I would avoid the use of many different animations, because it can just become very confusing and it ends up looking like a dated 1990s website or PowerPoint presentation. So if you've got points coming in, animations are fine, but try to just be as clean and as crisp as possible. And again, look to the design world to see how things are done there.
That's great advice, thank you. Sticking with the issue of digital presentation, that clearly is what everybody is concerned with. We've got a question coming in from Hugh, who's in Germany. This person is wondering, what are the 3 most practical, important tips on how to make a digital presentation interactive? And you've done some of this. Maybe you have some further suggestions.
Of course. So 3 tips. Number 1, first of all, find out exactly what is available on your platform, because certain platforms have more options for interactivity, other platforms have less options for interactivity. Almost all platforms have a chat function, however, so you can do something creative like getting people to write in responses in the form of a poem or just how you're enjoying this. So number 1, think about the platform that's available. Number 2, think about your audience. So if you're presenting to a group of people who, you know, are quite engaged and open and willing to try new things, going back to that earlier question, you can afford to be very creative. However, if you're speaking to a more serious group and people who might want to engage in a different way, then your interactivity might be a less creative but more impactful one. So tip number 1, think about the platform. Tip number 2, think about the audience. Tip number 3, as I said earlier, really build in specific opportunities for interactivity. So, you know, in my presentation, we had a point where we wrote a list poem. So an actual opportunity for a specific exercise, be that, hey everyone, I've spoke for 10 minutes now. I just want to hear everybody write in the chat 1 word that comes to mind when you think about this presentation, or write in 1 question. So build in that. So think about the platform, think about the audience, and build in a specific time in your digital presentation for that interactivity to take place. And my 3 top tips.
Thank you, Sam. So this is a question which is probably very topical for you right now. This is from To Tan Luan, also from Vietnam, wondering, you have the situation, you give a presentation and someone asks a really tricky question at the end, which makes you incredibly nervous. Do you have any tips on how to deal with this situation?
Yeah, of course. So I'll give you my tips for dealing with questions. First of all, if you don't know the answer to the question, you can say, I don't know. It's absolutely fine. But think about how you frame it. Imagine Suzanne's asking me a really hard question, right? I would say something like, do you know what? I hadn't thought about that before. That's a really interesting question. Maybe we could meet after this presentation to collaborate on a response together. You know, and that's a really different way of framing it in a positive way. Number 2, take several questions at once. And then what you do is, this is what politicians tend to do. They take 3 questions at once. They answer the easy ones first, and then they either just forget about the hard ones, or they give their brain time to process the hard ones as they go through. Tip number 2. Tip number 3, subvert the question slightly. So imagine I got asked the question, Sam, how do you answer difficult questions? If I don't know how to respond to that, I'd say, that's a really good question. Now, the way that I respond to answering difficult answers is that I choose not to have answers in the first place. So I've subtly subverted the question against something that politicians do. But in all of these, the best advice I can give is, if you don't know, just say you don't know. People are really accepting of that, but it's just how you frame it in a positive way. And oftentimes people have come up with questions that are brilliant, and you just don't have the time. If you're in an oral presentation as well, you might have 2 or 3 minutes for questions. If someone's asked you a question that is genuinely quite difficult, you might say, that's a really, really good question. I haven't got time to go into a response to it now, but could we meet for coffee, or could we meet offline to go and talk about this in detail? It's a brilliant question, thank you. So just be honest and think about reframing it.
Thank you, Sam. Now we have a couple more questions before we close, and I think this one here is interesting. It's from Joey Mark Diaz, and he's wondering, he's very intrigued, as I am, by this idea of publishing a poem in reference to a scientific work that you've done. So he's wondering whether you've done this before, whether you may even have an example, so that you published a poem instead of a poster presentation or the more standard form.
Many examples. I remember when I did my PhD, which is a long time ago now, that's when I really started. I was asked to do a presentation. I just wrote a poem about it instead. But I mean, a lot of my work is using poetry as a way to communicate science to different audiences. What I would say is, if you go to my website, samillingworth.com, you'll see many examples of my poetry that's been written about scientific research that I've done, about scientific research that other people have done. You'll find a link to our journal, Consilience. Please check us out. Feel free to submit your own work to us as well. I think poetry is a great way of encouraging people to communicate their work to different audiences in a different way, using a language that can be a bit more forgiving and flexible than scientific jargon at times.
Yeah, thank you. Sam, there's also a question from someone who I think has aspirations as a science communicator himself. This is from Zirikan. Zirikan is intrigued that you have clearly changed your professional track a little bit. You've moved from a research career to be more active in science communication. Now, he was wondering whether you could share a bit about your experience in switching towards science communication.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I'm still a researcher. I still do a lot of publications and books and presentations, but it's just around science communication now rather than atmospheric physics and climate change. What I would say is that my career trajectory is quite strange, so I don't know if it's an exemplar, but every single time you do something, just try to think about how it can benefit you for the next stage of your career, and really think carefully about what those career steps are going to be. So, for example, if you're really interested in doing science communication but still being in academia as a researcher, you need to be thinking about, how can I get publications in science communication? How can I get invited presentations? How can I develop that side of things? If you're interested in being a science communicator but outside of academia, you need to be thinking about, how can I develop my presence? How can I, have I got a vlog? Have I got a blog, which we might be talking about in our next presentation? How can I establish my digital footprint? So really thinking carefully about the kind of career that you want to have, and then the things that are necessary to enable you to take those steps are quite important. So for me, I knew that I really wanted to develop research in science communication, specifically around the geosciences and around climate change. But I knew that in order to do that, I needed to develop publications and expertise in that area. So that's what I tried really hard to do to enable me to get tenure, to get my associate professorship, etc.
Well, thank you so much, Sam. That was a really fabulous session. All of us, I think, have really enjoyed this. There are some questions that we haven't had time yet to answer, but we will make sure that Sam sees them, and maybe he has the opportunity to reply to some of you. Please make use of his kind offer to also contact him for some advice, and of course look at his website to see some of the poems that he's written in the past. Sam, that was a fabulously inspiring. I've personally learned a lot. To all of you, thank you so much for joining us. As we've said, the recording and the slides will be made available to you. Don't worry about it. You will receive an email from us shortly. And of course, Sam will be with us again on the 5th of May for the second part in this science communication series, where he will give us advice on how to create a digital footprint. So I invite all of you to join us again on the 5th of May for this next session in the Euraxis ASEAN Career Development webinar series. And with this, I think it's time for us to wish you a wonderful afternoon, evening, day. Thank you for joining us, and we see you all again soon.
Thank you. Please follow our social media accounts.
That was the social media wizard of Euraxis ASEAN. Please follow our social media accounts. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sam. That was absolutely fabulous. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and we'll see you all very soon. Bye.
Bye.
Bye now.